Earlier this year, Adidas successfully launched a new F50 model. But they didn't stop there, they also released a distinct Messi variation with its own unique features. Now, I reviewed the $160 F50 Messi Pro and I was pretty impressed. But today, we've got the more affordable F50 League, which comes in at $90. So if you're in the market for a budget-friendly football boot, more than likely, this is gonna be one that you're looking at. So in this video, we're gonna cover all the features of the F50 Messi League, and we'll also discuss how it compares and stacks up against other competitors at this price range. So stick around, and if you're interested in any of the boots that we discuss in this video, you can find links to them on sale in the description below with exclusive discount codes. So without further ado, let's get things started by going over the design. So first things first, what caught my eye when I got these out of the box was definitely the colorway, and usually I don't get that hyped about the colors of new football boots. I usually don't care that much, but this cloud white with the purple accents really reminds me of the older F50 Adizero for some reason. I think it came out around 15 years ago, and it was actually a white boot with pink accents, and I thought it looked so clean. So as far as capturing the more nostalgic F50 vibe, I definitely think they did well with the colorway. And then in terms of overall feature set, these are actually going to be really similar to the F50 League standard variation. So if you're not familiar, it would be the non-Messi version. And for anyone that doesn't know, I actually thought that the standard F50 League was one of the best boots that you can get at $90, so that's a pretty good comparison to have. But there is one key difference between this Messi variation of the F50 League and the standard one, and that is going to be the material that is used in the upper. Because on the standard version of the F50 League, they use a material that's called fiber skin, and it does have a slightly more obviously synthetic feel to it, but one thing it also has is a ridged texture, whereas when you look at the F50 Messi League, it actually has a hybrid touch upper that has a completely smooth finish, and in my opinion, it almost gives off the sensation of a synthetic type of leather. And then the only slight texturing you will get is just on the 3 stripes of the Adidas logo, which does have a slightly ribbed pattern to it. Other than that, the lacing system running through the center of the boot is going to be really simple with this traditional U-throat design. But the tongue is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. Because in the more expensive variations of the F50 Messi, so if you look at the Messi Pro and the Messi Elite, they actually have something called a burrito tongue, which apparently Messi likes to personally wear. And that burrito style tongue is attached on one side of the upper and then free on the other side. But unlike those more expensive versions, the F50 Messi League that I have here does not have the burrito tongue, and it actually has the same floating tongue that Adidas likes to call it that's used on the standard F50 League. Now, I used to call this design a tunnel tongue because that's just what it reminded me of, but the floating tongue is a pretty good description, and if you can see here, the tongue is basically attached on both sides of the insole here, so it's attached on either side of the bottom of the boot basically, and it's basically made of a very thin, slightly stretchy fabric. And as I mentioned, this is the same tongue that's used in the standard F50 League, and I like it. It does a good job of just providing consistent lockdown throughout the entire length of your foot. It's also pretty thin and minimal, so it doesn't feel like it's getting in the way too much either. I think you may think at first glance, just looking at the boots, that it might seem a little bit gimmicky that the tongue is attached on both sides of the boot here, but I actually think it does serve a decent purpose, and it does add to the overall fit and experience of wearing the boots. And it's nice to see that it's been included here despite the fact it's a 3rd tier takedown. And then with a little bit of effort prying off some of the temporary glue that's there, the insole is going to be somewhat easily removable. The heel area has a decent amount of padding to it, but I should note it is going to be a little bit thicker and more chunky compared to that $160 Pro version, and of course it's going to be a bit thicker than the more expensive $260 Elite version. In terms of weight, the Messi League is going to come in at about 255 grams in the size 10.5 US that I have here, and that puts it at not the lightest boot, but also not the heaviest. For reference, the F50 Elite is going to be closer to around 190 grams, and that's one of the lightest boots on the entire market. And then heavier football boots are going to be more than 300 grams, so I'd say it's fairly middle of the road in terms of weight. They certainly aren't going to be dragging you down when you've got them on feet. And the sole plate is not going to be anything too crazy either. It's going to be an MG or multi-ground stud pattern that Adidas like to call it, so it's going to have a combination of both conical studs at the side side of the forefoot here, and then slightly more pointed studs towards the front of the foot and running through the center. Now, when it comes to sole plates, I usually like using all conical studs on artificial grass just because it helps to reduce some of the rotational traction, and I think that they're a little bit safer, but I will note that even the slightly more aggressive studs on this MG sole plate here, they're actually somewhat rounded at the corners, so I wouldn't be too worried about taking these on an artificial grass pitch, but in my opinion, I think they are best suited for use on FG. Next up, let's talk about the fit and feel of these boots. Now, obviously, my hopes were really high when I got these on for the first time because I did love the standard F50 league, and ultimately, I wasn't disappointed with these. And the first thing that I noticed that the ankle and heel area that I pointed out before was extremely comfortable. And generally, I really don't mind if there's extra padding around the ankle and heel. Some people might feel that's a little bit bulky, but in general, as long as the boots aren't dragging me down and I don't feel that they're heavy on feet, if there's a little bit more padding along the heel, I just don't mind it. And then that floating elasticated tongue that I mentioned does a great job at just wrapping around your foot. There's no bunching up or uncomfortable areas whatsoever. Now, in terms of length, I got these in my standard size 10.5 US, and I found that the length was appropriate. So if you are thinking about picking up a pair, I'd recommend going true to size. In terms of width, I would put these probably about average, somewhere in the middle of the pack. I would say they might be just a little bit wider than some of the competing models from Nike, but if you compare them to other boots from New Balance, I think New Balance generally is going to be a little bit wider across the toe box area, but for most players, unless you have really wide feet, I think you should be able to be accommodated by the F50s. And if you do happen to have much wider feet, you might be better off checking over at New Balance or maybe Mizuno or potentially even a brand like Asics. Now, in terms of the material, this new hybrid touch that Adidas have here, it is very soft to the touch, and because it's pretty thin, you also do notice that softness on feet, but I will remind you that since this is a synthetic, it probably isn't going to be stretching very much over time. So if you try them on, make sure you like the fit as soon as you get them on feet, because they're not really going to mold to your feet that much as you play in them. And I will say, while the $90 F50 League here does feel relatively minimal, I do think that the $160 Pro version is going to offer a slightly thinner upper that gives you a little bit more flexibility throughout the length of the foot. Now, is it a $70 difference in terms of feel on feet and comfort? It really depends who you're asking and how much money that is for you, but in my opinion, it's not that much of an improvement. I would say the Pro version compared to this with the upper is maybe only 10 to 15% better. Overall, since this is a third tier takedown, I'm really impressed with how it stacks up in terms of feel against its more expensive counterparts. The lockdown is also great, especially back towards the ankle and heel area, and I didn't notice any uncomfortable pressure points once I got the laces tied up. And that's a really important point because on a lot of affordable football boots, especially some under that $100 price point, the lockdown just isn't that good, and sometimes you can end up with your heel slipping around, but this is just not a problem you're going to run into if you get these boots. Next up, let's talk about what these were actually like to play in. So I actually had a lot of fun in the F50 Messi League, but I do want to say just off the top that they were kind of at a slight disadvantage because I was trying these out around the same time that I was trying out the New Balance 442 V2 Pro, the more recent edition that came out this past year. And honestly, these boots are just so good. But to be fair, they come in at $130, so they are $40 more expensive than the Messi League here, so it's not really a fair comparison. When it came to the touch on the ball, when you're dribbling or juggling, you get a lot of sensitivity because, as I mentioned, this upper is going to be pretty thin, and you get a really nice softness from it as well. Then the traction I got from the sole plate was also really consistent. I didn't notice any slipping whatsoever, but as I mentioned before, this is probably the threshold of how aggressive I would want a sole plate to be on artificial grass. So if you are someone who's recovering from an injury and you're looking for a boot that's going to provide maybe a little bit less aggressive traction on an artificial surface, you might want to check out something that has conical studs or just generally an artificial grass specific sole plate. And while I do really like the synthetic leather approach that's used in this Hyper Touch material that's on the F50 Messi League, I think I may actually slightly prefer the full synthetic upper, well, they're both synthetic, but the more obviously synthetic upper that's used on the standard F50 League. I just like the slightly more slick finish that you get on the fiber skin upper, I think it's called, for the standard F50, and what I really like is the more ridge texture that you get throughout the upper. Honestly, I do think it gives you just a little bit more grip and traction with the ball when you're shooting. But in terms of which upper you like more between the Hybrid Touch and then the fiber skin, it's really just going to come down to personal preference. I wouldn't necessarily say that one is better than the other. And as I mentioned, since the F50 Messi League is going to have a slightly thicker upper than the Pro version, I did notice the slightest amount of bunching up, especially towards the base of the toe box area, so right around here when you're walking and running. But typically, this is something that does reduce a little bit as you wear the boots over time. And as I already stated, with the lockdown being great, I didn't notice any blisters around the heel area, which was also a great sign. For a budget football boot under that $100 price point, it's overall just going to do a good job at giving you that speed boot, thin, minimalist type sensation. Next up, let's talk about value. So the F50 Messi League comes in at $90 US, and I have to say, I think that the F50 League, whether you get the standard version or the Messi version here, I do think it's probably the best value in the entire Adidas lineup. And that didn't used to be the case. Most of the time, I would actually recommend that people check out the Pro version, which is the second tier that usually goes between $150 and $160. But I just think that the feature set that you get on the third takedown of the F50 series here, it's just so consistent with the more expensive versions. And well, yeah, they're a few grams heavier and there's going to be a little bit more padding towards the back of the heel. All of those features that you look for on a great football boot, so comfort, lockdown, performance, they're all still there. And when you do get around the $90 price point, there just aren't a lot of great contenders, and that makes it really easy to recommend the F50. But while I said there aren't a lot of contenders, there are some other great boots at this price point that you should know about. So with that being said, let's talk about the competition. So first up, we have another great value football boot from Adidas, and that's going to be the Copa Gloro 2, which comes in at a retail price of $99. So as opposed to the synthetic that's in the F50, the Copa Gloro 2 is going to have a full calfskin leather upper, and it's also going to have a slightly wider fit towards the toe box compared to the F50. And on top of that, it's just got a more retro aesthetic to it. It's got that fold over tongue with an elasticated strap. It gives a more old school feel. It's also going to be a little bit heavier and feel more padded on feet. They're really both great budget options from Adidas. I would say if you want something a little bit more modern with a thinner, more sensitive touch, go for the F50 League. But if you want something more traditional, you like that soft padded feel of natural leather, then check out the Copa Gloro 2. And then I want to give another shout out to the Nike Premier 3. That boot retails for $120. You can often find it on sale though for around $100. It is also going to be a full calfskin leather football boot, but a little bit more slim compared to the Copa Gloro. It has somewhat of a leather speed boot feel. It feels really thin on feet. I think it's one of the Nike's best budget boots. So if you do want a more premium leather football boot, but you don't want to spend more than $100, $110, the Nike Premier 3 is another great option. And then another underrated boot from Nike I wanted to call out would be the Tiempo Legend 10 Academy. Now that boot is going to retail for around $80 to $90, but at this point it's been out for so long you can probably find it for $60 to $70. And that's a great football boot. It goes for a similar synthetic leather approach that you get from the Hybrid Touch upper on the F50 here. I will say it maybe is a touch more on the bulkier side towards the rest of the upper, not just the heel area being a bit bulky, but it still gives you great lockdown, and the fly touch that's used on the Tiempo Legend 10 Academy, it feels great. I would say it can easily rival the material that's used in the F50 Messi League here. I would say maybe the key advantage that the F50 has over the Legend 10 Academy in that instance is going to be just the tongue. I think that this floating tongue is just a little bit more premium than the more bulky traditional system that's used in the Legend 10 Academy. Another quick comparison, because they're about the same price, the Puma Future Match. This is the Future 7 match. The F50 Messi League is just going to be better pretty much in every way. I think that while the Puma Future 7 match is quite comfortable and, you know, they feel good when you're walking around casually, from a performance perspective, I just don't quite think that their lockdown is going to be, I'd say, good enough for a lot of players. So in my opinion, that just takes the F50 over the edge. And then finally, I just wanted to mention the other two third-tier takedowns from Adidas. So those would be the Adidas Predator League as well as the Copa Pure 2 League. So I tried on both of those boots, and while they were pretty decent, I would say that they feel pretty far removed from some of the more expensive versions. And while I did like some aspects of the Predator, and I even thought there were some decent aspects of the Copa Pure 2 League, I just think there's better options at that price point, and this is going to be one of them. I think that the F50 League is just the best third-tier takedown that Adidas sells. And I really think it's their only third-tier takedown that can comfortably compete with, say, some of the second-tier takedowns and just generally more expensive boots from different brands. So what are my final thoughts on the F50 Messi League? Well, I'll say it again, just like I did for the standard variation, these are great takedown boots, definitely some of the best that you can currently get on the market. If I were to give Adidas any advice about potential design changes to this boot, I would tell them to keep most of the things the same because I think they are a very reliable pair of boots. Maybe I would suggest add just a ½ centimeter of width just to the top of the toe box to make them more accommodating for the majority of players. But to be fair to Adidas, I think most brands could do with adding just a little bit more width to the toe box of their boots. So yeah, from Adidas, I think these and the standard F50 League are going to be your best bet at the $90 price point. If you get a chance, I would maybe try on both of them and just see which one you like more. Now, if you've got a little bit more money to spend and you want a hybrid touch upper that's just a little bit thinner, a little bit softer, and gives you slightly more of that leather-like feel, I would recommend going up to the $160 F50 Messi Pro. And then beyond that, I don't think the $260 Elites are going to be that necessary. I think after the Pros, you're really just getting diminishing returns. And guys, that is going to do it for this video. Let me know in the comments if you've gotten the chance to try on these boots and what you think of them. Also, subscribe to the channel. We're doing a subscriber-only giveaway when we hit 20,000 subs. Hopefully, it should be within the next month or so. Really excited for that one. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Like if you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video.